wife's family decided to go on a family moon, and we all family
Never
moon.
heard of that.
And we they do that. They do these moon trips, and we all went to Portugal. And I got back just a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
So,
mazel tov.
yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's good to be back. It's good to see you all. We're going to dive back into the Gospel of Mark. So just quick recap. Last class, we basically spent the entire time talking about what we cannot know with regards to Mark and the historical Jesus. So basically, in a nutshell, last class was about when investigating the Gospel of Mark on its own, it's not a quest for the historical Jesus. Rather, it's a quest to try as best as we can decipher what this particular author might have thought about who Jesus was from this author's perspective. Okay, we don't know who this author technically is. In all likelihood, this author is a man, well educated, because most people, weren't. Most people cannot read or write. So the fact that this person could write meant that he had access to education that most people could not. That being said, his grammar is not at all to the level of not just other gospel accounts, but more widespread Greek literature. So the entirety of the New Testament is written in Greek. If we go by the assumption that Mark is written first, and whoever wrote Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark and writing their own prose, Matthew and Luke clean up the grammar of Mark. So while that's one of the reasons why scholars think that Mark is indeed written first. Like, why would Mark purposefully mess up his grammar? Although there are some theorists who think that messing up the language of the empire can be something purposeful, as a way to just kind of like throw a middle finger at the empire. So it's possible. Again, last class I said everything that I say can have a counterpoint and counterpoint and counterpoint and counterpoint. But generally speaking, the idea is that this author is a man writing around the 1st century of the Common Era, perhaps around 70 of the Common Era, in the face of the destruction of the temple by the Romans, after or in the culmination of the Jewish-Roman War, well educated, but perhaps not as educated or well versed in Greek grammar as other gospel writers and other Greek thinkers.
Has anybody considered its translation?
Sure. Yeah, that the messiness of the Greek is coming from a scribe, like a copier, who messed up Mark's original grammar.
That might have been in a different language, like Aramaic.
I see. Usually sure. Yeah, sometimes folks think perhaps an original copy, but we have no original copies, are perhaps in a different language from Greek. Typically, though, Matthew is the one that is thought to have been in Aramaic first. And whoever wrote the book of Revelation has thought that his primary language was Aramaic, because his grammar kind of like, he writes in Greek, but it fits the Aramaic style more. Mark doesn't get that assumption as much. Is it possible? Sure, anything is possible. We know very little. Okay. So we're going to dive into Mark, but rather than trying to ask ourselves, who was Jesus as a historical figure, we're going to ask ourselves, who is this person for this author in particular? And if we were going to continue this series beyond Mark, and then go to Matthew, and then go to Luke, and then go to John, we can really see how Mark's characterization of Jesus is, sure, he has shared qualities to the other gospels, but nonetheless, Mark's Jesus is distinct, just as Matthew's Jesus is distinct, Luke's Jesus and John's Jesus, and the non-canonical gospel Jesus are also quite distinct. Okay. So any questions before we dive into Mark's story? I'm going to share this video. There is closed captioning. I, generally speaking, do recommend this site on YouTube called the Bible Project. There are synopses of, most, if not all, canonical and some non-canonical sources. That being said, there is, just as all of us do, interpretation being put onto the overview. So it may seem like this is just a very objective synopsis or summary of Mark's story, and it's the best I can find online that can just kind of get us all on the same page in terms of, what is the summary of Mark's gospel. But there are some elements in this video that are put onto the story, and I'll share with you what they are when we get there. So for now, here's just a brief summary of Mark's gospel so that we can, again, all be on the same page before going to specific verses that tell us something about who Mark's Jesus might be.
The Gospel according to Mark is one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus, and our earliest historical traditions link this book to a Christian scribe named Mark, or John Mark. He was a co-worker with Paul and a close partner with Peter. And in fact, an ancient church historian named Papias, he recalls that Mark had collected all of the eyewitness accounts and memories of Peter and then shaped them into this account. But Mark didn't just randomly throw the pieces together. He's carefully designed this story of Jesus. In the first line of the book, Mark makes this claim about Jesus. It's the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, what's interesting is that this is the only time Mark is going to tell you what he thinks. For the rest of the book, he's going to influence you by simply putting Jesus's actions and words in front of you and showing you how other people react to him. Now, Mark's designed the story of Jesus as a drama with 3 acts. The first one set in Galilee, the third one is set in Jerusalem, and the second act shows Jesus on the way from one place to the other. And each of the acts focuses on a repeated theme. So in Act 1, everybody's blown away by Jesus, and they're wondering, who is this Jesus? In Act 2, it's the disciples who are struggling to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And then in Act 3, we watch the surprising paradox of how Jesus becomes the Messianic King. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it unfolds. After the opening line, Mark begins with a quotation from the ancient prophets Isaiah and Malachi, who said that God would send a messenger to Israel to prepare them for when God would show up himself to rescue his people and become their king. And Mark introduces John the Baptist as that messenger, and then right when you expect God to show up personally, Mark introduces Jesus. And as he comes onto the scene, the heavens open, God's Spirit descends on Jesus, and God says, "You are my beloved Son." After this, Mark places in front of us a summary of Jesus' core message. He went about Galilee announcing the good news that God's kingdom has come near. Jesus is carrying forward the story from the Old Testament scriptures about God's rescue operation for his world. Through Jesus, God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil and its hold on people's lives, and then by inviting them to live under his reign by following Jesus. From here, Mark's given us a big block of stories showing us Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom. He goes about healing people whose bodies are sick or broken or under the oppression of dark spiritual powers. And Jesus even does something that for Jewish people only God has the right to do. He forgives people's sins. And Jesus' actions here produce lots of different responses. So some people follow him and become his disciples. Other people don't know what to think, and still others reject him completely, especially Israel's leaders who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. But Jesus isn't surprised by these responses. In fact, he draws attention to it. In chapter 4, Mark has collected many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of God's kingdom. And Jesus says that his message is like seed falling on different types of soil. Some are receptive, some are not. Or it's like a mustard seed that's very tiny. It seems insignificant, but then it grows huge and surprises everyone. Jesus' point is that he really is the Messiah, bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anybody expected. And this growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is connected to a key idea Mark emphasizes at the end of Act 1, that even among Jesus' disciples there's confusion. Even they are struggling to grasp who Jesus really is, and that brings us to Act 2. It begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and he asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter speaks up saying, "You're the Messiah." But it becomes clear that for Peter, this means that Jesus is a victorious military king from the line of David who will rescue Israel from the Romans. But for Jesus to be the Messiah means that he's the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who will bring God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they don't get it. They think following King Jesus is going to mean fame and status and importance, and Jesus makes it clear that following him is actually like dying, like carrying your own cross. It means rejecting violence and pride and selfishness and giving one's life out for others in acts of service and love. He has the same conversation with them 2 more times, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many. The disciples still don't get it. They respond in confusion and fear. And so here in Act 2, Mark has placed another key story that echoes the book's introduction. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain, and he's suddenly transformed. He's radiating with light and glory, and a cloud envelops them. Now, this is just like the glory of the God of Israel that showed up long ago on Mount Sinai. And then the 2 prophets who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai, Moses and Elijah, they appear next to Jesus as God announces again, "This is my beloved Son." Now, by placing this story in the middle of all these conversations in Act 2, Mark is making an astounding claim that Jesus, God's Son, is the physical embodiment of God's own glory. And in Jesus, the glorious God of Israel is going to become king by suffering and dying for the sins of his own people. It's a puzzling claim that confuses and scares the disciples as they leave the mountain. Which brings us to Act 3. Jesus makes a very public royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover. People are hailing him as the Messiah. Then he enters into the temple courtyard and he asserts his royal authority by running out the thieves and crooks and stopping the sacrificial system. Then this kicks off a whole week of Jesus debating and confronting the leaders of Israel, condemning their hypocrisy, and so they set in motion a plan to have him killed. And Jesus warns his disciples, predicting that Jerusalem and its temple will be destroyed within a generation, and his disciples will be persecuted just like him, until he returns one day to bring God's kingdom fully over the world. And it all leads up to the final night. Jesus has his last Passover meal with the disciples, a symbolic meal that told the story of Israel's liberation from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And Jesus takes these symbols and he gives them new meaning. They point to the liberation from sin and death that will happen through the death of the suffering servant Messiah. From here, the story rushes forward to Jesus' arrest, his trial before Israel's priests and the Roman governor Pilate, all resulting in Jesus' crucifixion. And it culminates in a key scene that matches the important scenes from Acts 1 and 2, except this time it's darkness that descends, not a cloud. And instead of the divine voice from heaven, it's Jesus' voice crying out before he dies. And then most surprising is that it's a Roman soldier who sees Jesus die, who grasps and then announces who Jesus is. This man was the Son of God. He's the first person in the story to recognize the story's shocking claim about Jesus' identity, that it's the crucified Son of God who's the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for his friends and for his enemies. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb, and on the first day of the new week, 2 women from his disciples come to the tomb, and they discover that the tomb is empty, the stone's rolled away, and an angelic man informs them that Jesus isn't here, that he's risen from the dead. And so he orders them to go and tell this good news to the other disciples, that Jesus is alive, that he'll meet them back up in Galilee. And the women, they're freaked out. Mark says that they fled from the tomb in terror, telling no one, for they were afraid. And that's how the book ends, with Jesus' disciples showing the same kind of fear and confusion that concluded Acts 2 and 1. Now, if you look in your Bible, you'll see that the Gospel of Mark has more to its ending, where Jesus appears, he speaks to his disciples, but there's also a note there telling you that that ending is not part of the original book, that it's only found in later, less reliable manuscripts. Now, it's possible that the original ending got lost, or that Mark actually never finished writing his account, but it's more likely that this abrupt ending is intentional to make a point. The entire story has focused on the shocking claim that puzzled Jesus' disciples from beginning to end, that it's the suffering, crucified, and risen Jesus who's the Messiah, the Son of God. That God's love and upside-down kingdom were revealed as Jesus died for the sins of the world. And so this story ends without closure, and it forces you, the reader, to grapple with this very strange and scandalous claim about Jesus. And are you going to run away like the disciples? Or are you going to recognize Jesus as your king and go and tell the good news? And only you can answer that question. And that's what the Gospel of Mark is all about.
Okay, so before we dive into specifics, I'll just open up the room and ask you, based on that synopsis, who do you think Mark's Jesus is? Who is this character, figure, person?
It's more than one answer.
Of course, yeah. So you could, say one, say two. What do you think?
This is funny was the thing where it says Jesus was the embodiment of God's glory. That really kind of hit me. By the way, I hadn't. I was going to say the same thing. The embodiment of God. And in Christianity, we believe in the Trinity. So he was the embodiment of the Trinity, of them, rather than just of, he was a human being, but he was, okay, the embodiment is a good one. And we believe he was divine.
Did the word Trinity come up at all, though?
No, it didn't. No, definitely didn't.
So that's not a full-fledged concept yet,
Right, right.
but it comes up in later interpretation. But that's not here. As of now, Mark is not saying that Jesus is part of any sort of Trinity. Not there.
Definitely the Son of God.
Son of God is named. In fact, that's the first line. So we can open up our Bibles. Let's just go back. Just go to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. It says, the beginning of the good news. Remember, gospel means good news. So we're opening up to this supposed idea that we're entering good news. I mentioned last class that Mark's is a gospel where it's unclear if this is earnest good news from Mark's perspective or if it is satire. And the satire it'll all come together next class, I promise. But for now, let's go with it. Good news of Jesus Christ, so called Christ, and also called the Son of God. So we have to be careful here because these are terms that are in our modern vocabulary and have come to mean certain things in modernity. So when we see Christ, and especially when we see Son of God, we might automatically assume, for example, that this line is saying that Jesus is carrying substance of God, that Jesus is indeed divine. Okay? But this is a text written in the first century of the Common Era. And so we have to ask ourselves, what did these words mean in the first century of the Common Era? I'm sorry to say that Son of God is not necessarily, and in fact, in most cases when it comes up, does not mean divinity. Instead, it means a human who has a deep connection with the God of Israel. For example, David, a human, an ancient Israelite king, is referred to as God's son because the Israelite God had a special relationship with David, thought fondly of David, and cared for David. The Israelite nation, the people of Israel, are called children of God, that God has a special relationship with this Israelite nation. Christ also doesn't carry with it any sort of divine connotation on its own. It's also not Jesus' last name. Christ is a title. Christ is just from the Greek Christos, which is from the Hebrew Moshiach. It just means Messiah. So this author is saying, I have some good news about this person, Yeshua, who I believe is the Messiah, and who, as the Messiah, I also believe has a special relationship with the God of Israel. So we have to go further and say, what did it mean for a Jew of the first century? Or it's unclear this author is a Jewish follower of Jesus as the Messiah or a Gentile follower of Jesus as the Messiah. We have to keep in mind that by the time this author is writing, a guy named Paul has already spread the word of Jesus as Messiah predominantly to non-Jews. So it's very possible that this author is a non-Jewish follower of Jesus. Nonetheless, regardless of this author's ethnicity, Jewishness at this time period is an ethnic category that had theological implications. This author is entering Jewish conversations, Jewish theological conversations, whether as a Jew or as a non-Jew. And to call someone the Messiah, the Christos, is automatically to enter a Jewish idea. The Messiah is fundamentally, at this time period, a Jewish idea. It is not anything else other than perhaps you could say it's for non-Jews entering this Jewish conversation. So even Gentiles at this time period believing in Jesus as the Christ is not separate from Jewish conversations. They are just non-Jews entering Jewish theology and thinking about Jewish theology. There's no Christianity that does not exist for a few hundred years. Christianity in any way, shape, or form, as we know it today, does not look like anything until the end of the 4th century of the Common Era. So we are very much in a world of Jewishness and paganism, and to be a Gentile talking about Jesus as the Christ is to be a Gentile talking Jewishly. And so to think of someone as the Messiah is to believe that this person is in the line of King David. So this author, by calling Jesus Son of God, is calling this person, is referring to this person as David was referred to, connecting Jesus to David, because the messianic expectation to believe in Jesus as the Messiah was for most to think that this person would be connected to King David, the ancient king of Israel, who gets glorified by the time Jesus is born. Beyond that, those who believed in a Messiah thought that this person in the line of David would overthrow the powers that be and create a new world order in which the God of Israel would be seen by everyone as God. So everyone in the world would join this movement and believe that the God of Israel is God, and Messiah is the one to bring that in by overthrowing whatever powers are in place at the time. So Rome is the power in place at the time. So to call Jesus the Messiah is to believe that Jesus will overthrow Rome and create a new world order in which everyone sees that the God of Israel is God.
Is that why you have the centurion saying that Jesus is the Son of God? That's the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire? So
that's the major line that is a huge, huge interpretation onto the text, because these texts are not originally written with any punctuation. So to have the Roman soldier see Jesus on the cross and say, wow, this is the guy, this is the Son of God, this is the person that is close to the Israelite people, and sort of like making it seem like he's totally on board believing that this guy is the Messiah. Whoever made this video put an exclamation point at the end of that claim, it could have very well been a question mark. This Messiah, the guy who's dying under my Roman hands, who's supposed to overthrow Rome, is your Messiah? We don't know.
That is very interesting. I like that.
Yeah. So opening line, good news about this guy named Jesus who calling the Christ the Messiah, the one who will overthrow the powers that be and create a new world order in which the God of Israel is the God of all people, Son of God, has a closeness with the God of Israel. Any questions so far? Any concerns? Dislikes? I'm going to make it a little easier in just a second, because he's also called something else, not just Son of God,
Son of Man.
Son of Man.
Yeah.
And that one does carry divine connotations for the time period. It's tricky because you hear Son of God now and you're like, clearly that means divine. You hear Son of Man and you think that's human. It's reversed. So when you look at the ancient texts, the ancient Jewish texts that someone like Mark is relying on in making sense of who Jesus is, the book of Daniel is where we see the phrase Son of Man pop up. And the Son of Man is a figure lingering in the divine realm. And it is given a seat at the right-hand side of God in the divine realm. The divine realm in ancient Judaism is vast and has lots and lots and lots of beings in it. So you have God at the head, and then you have lots of angelic beings. And then you have in this book, Daniel, this character called the Son of Man, who is another being in the divine space. And the ancient one is what God is referred to. Daniel says, hey, I want you to have a seat right next to me. And don't worry about all this chaos that is happening in the world. I am going to grant you dominion over a new world order in which everyone will finally see that I am God. So the book of Daniel, chapter 7, has one of the only allusions in the Christian Old Testament to a messianic age, the age in which a Messiah will overthrow the powers that be and usher in this new world order. And it's thought that perhaps Jesus' followers are trying to make sense of Jesus as that Son of Man. Daniel's written a couple hundred years prior to Mark, and whoever wrote Mark has knowledge of Daniel and is thinking maybe that figure, the Son of Man, is an allusion to my Jesus at this time period. Okay, Daniel's not thinking of Jesus. Jesus isn't born yet, but Mark is thinking of Jesus in light of this earlier source, where we have this figure called the Son of Man, who seems to be having at least access to the divine realm and will be given dominion over this new world order, a potential messianic age. So Mark's Jesus so far has a closeness with God and has access to the divine realm through being called Son of Man. Okay, so we have humanness and divineness, just with titles that we need to swap in our own modern brains.
But I don't remember which gospel it is, but doesn't Jesus say it himself?
That he is
That's
the Son of Man.
I think in one
I
of the
believe
gospels.
so. Yes. I as well not think of it, but then at the same time, we have to remind ourselves that Jesus didn't write this.
Right.
So we have to say, okay, well, does this author want Jesus to be making the claim on his own? Maybe whatever gospel that is, but that doesn't mean that the historical Jesus ever made the claim. We don't know if the historical Jesus ever called himself Son of God or Son of Man or the Messiah. We don't know. Questions so far on what it meant in the first century to call someone the Messiah, the Son of God, and the Son of Man? Okay, so what else does Jesus do in this gospel? What else did you get from that video?
Died and resurrected.
Okay, so what's interesting, there's no birth narrative in Mark. I don't know if any of you noticed that. The only two gospels that have a birth narrative are Matthew and Luke, and those are vastly different. The Christmas story is a combination of Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke have two completely different birth narratives. But Mark doesn't have a birth narrative. It sort of opens up with Jesus as an adult human spreading or traveling around spreading his theologies. And then eventually he dies under the hands of Rome and is resurrected. What does he do though in between? So we're opening up into this good news, Son of God, Son of Man. In fact, he's called Son of Man in chapter 2, verse 28. So very quickly, he's getting these titles out. Mark is saying, this is good news, this is the Christ, got the title. This is the Son of Man, and this is the Son of God. What does he do before he dies and is resurrected, according to Mark's story? Teaches. Heals. Excellent. So he goes around and teaches. What does he teach? He's teaching his understanding of Jewishness. Okay, he's spreading what he believes is the best way to be Jewish to others. He's healing people. Right. So in chapter 1, verses 40 to 45, he heals someone with leprosy. Okay. What's interesting is that to heal anyone isn't part of the messianic expectation. When I say messianic expectation, I mean the common understanding of what to expect from the Christ, from the Messiah. Okay. So again, the messianic expectation is the idea that a Moshiach or a Christos in the line of David will overthrow the powers that be and usher in a new world order in which everyone is seeing that the God of Israel is God. right? Not Zeus, not Jupiter, not these other beings, but the Israelite God. Nowhere in that is the idea that this person needs to go around and heal people. So that's just a bonus. That this guy goes around and heals folks. Okay, that's not part of the expectation. That's not necessarily adding or it's not necessarily adding to the the proof that this guy is the guy. Okay, in fact, most things that Jesus does in Mark doesn't add any proof whatsoever, because at the end of the day, Rome kills him. He doesn't overthrow Rome. Rome overthrows him. He's not going around, leading, like gathering an army and overthrowing the emperor. Right? He's going around healing people. So it's interesting.
Same is
Interesting
true
thing to think about.
about teaching the parables, right? That's not part of the
Right.
expectation.
Right. Yep. It's not even necessarily part of the expectation to go around and just share your theologies, right? It was really to help usher in this new world order. And perhaps Mark is thinking that the way to do it is to, talk about it. Like, let's talk this through and get to a different place. But we don't know, right? Mark isn't saying, this is my understanding of the messianic expectation. This is how I see Jesus fit into it. We don't have a full unpacking of Mark's thoughts here, unfortunately.
So what were the expectations?
Just to overthrow the powers that be and usher in a new world order. So again, it is possible that Mark is thinking the way to do it is to talk it out and have, and is picturing Jesus as going around and trying to bring people on board to the God of Israel. But interestingly, remember, everything can be countered. Jesus isn't talking to folks that he would need to get on board to bring in a new world order. He's talking to fellow Jews who are already on board with the God of Israel. So interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Just a comment on in our Nicene Creed, which we say every day at Mass, it says Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered and died. Nothing in between. They don't mention anything
Yeah.
in between.
Yeah, right.
And it's criticized by a lot of Catholic theologians that needs to go in there, or we need to get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, the Nicene Creed was created around like 324, 325 of the Common Era, and it's kind of incredible that it's still recited in the way that it is. But that version of Christ confessing this, that's in the Nicene Creed, that's the version that won. But you have to imagine there are centuries of fights of who this guy is and what he did, and to even agree on that line or those few lines is kind of amazing. But that's probably as far as they could go, and to get enough people on board with that to continue that Nicene version.
Yeah.
But we have to teach it. There's no Nicene Creed yet. There's no agreement of Jesus' substance. There's no agreement of where he comes from or who he is or what he did. People are crafting their own narratives, really in long form for the first time in Mark's time period.
So that coming off that comment, I think I might have asked you about this before. Paul already had written this body of letters. And they had not focused on what happened.
Correct.
What Jesus taught.
Correct. So
is Mark a pushback or a feedback saying, hey, this other stuff also matters?
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea, but I like it. It's in a way, it kind of parallels the pushback to the Nicene Creed.
Right.
Like, I mean, Mark didn't know that would end up happening, this Nicene Creed, but it's kind of like, maybe he's like, why are we only focusing on Jesus's death and resurrection? Like, why don't we talk about what he actually did in his life? And this is what I imagine him doing. Possible. Totally possible.
Because it does have that effect. If you were to reverse the order of the
Yes.
gospel, of the New Testament,
Yes,
and tell it chronologically,
yes.
you would immediately jump to that
I'm like, who
notion.
is this
It's like,
guy?
wait,
Yeah.
this is,
Mhm.
we need to know more.
Yes.
Okay, well, here's what happened in
Yes.
between.
Yes, 100%. Right. So when I teach Intro to New Testament, I teach Paul first.
Ah.
We do Paul's letters first, and then we do the Gospels.
Interesting. That must give the students a different feel.
If they want to be be there in the first place.
We need to teach that to graduate students.
I know, I do. I start another grad class tomorrow. I'm very excited. But okay, what else? Someone actually mentioned this. about
Sarah?
class. Yeah?
Sarah, now, I just had a question. This is Bonnie. I'm on Zoom. Why do you think gospel or gospel-like writings weren't written when Jesus was alive?
Why do I think what writings?
They weren't written.
Why were they
Yeah,
written
yeah,
so far
great
after the
question.
fact
Why-
and nothing was written during the time that he was actually alive?
Yeah, great question. So,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah, so the question is, why don't folks think that stories about Jesus, weren't written when Jesus was actually living? So one, I mean, they seemed, at first of all, we really don't know the day in and day out, but perhaps they were busy, they were doing things, they were traveling around and spreading their understanding of Jewishness. But also it's unlikely that they could. I mean, this isn't a big movement at the time in which Jesus was living, and it's still not a big movement by the time whoever this Mark person is writing. So there's not people to care enough to write. It's kind of miraculous that someone cares, 40 years later and is trying to put something down, but it's very unclear if any of Jesus' followers had the ability to write something down.
And they probably weren't literate.
Yeah, exactly.
They also thought that he was coming back to life again, so they didn't need to. He was going to be back in the near future.
Well, we don't know if people actually thought that at the time. We don't know. So that's also not part of the messianic expectation. It never said he needs to die or suffer. What's interesting is that Mark is writing this after Jesus did die. So if you still believe that Jesus is the Messiah, you have to make sense of it in light of Jesus' suffering and death. You have to, otherwise it doesn't work. So is it part of the actual messianic expectation to suffer and die? No. Are there texts though that indicate some sort of mover and shaker of the Jewish world to suffer? Yes. There is an excerpt in Isaiah. So Mark is grabbing onto that, as many people did, right? This is called midrash in Jewishness, filling in the gaps, making sense of what is missing. And you can understand the gospel narratives as their own form of midrash, of saying, okay, we still believe that Jesus is the Messiah. We understand that not everything is connecting for him to be the Messiah if he's supposed to overthrow Rome and Rome overthrew him. But we still think he is the Christ. We're going to have to reread our text and figure out how to make it make sense. So this is another part of Mark's story. Jesus suffers, and Mark wants to put into the mouth of Jesus that Jesus is predicting his own suffering, right? He doesn't want this to be a surprise for the readers. Whereas historically speaking, it very well could have been a shock to followers of Jesus. If followers of Jesus in his own time believed that he would create a new world order, and all of a sudden he dies under the order he's supposed to overthrow, for many that could have been tragic, traumatizing, heartbreaking, and a huge shock. Decades have passed though, and there are some that still believe and are trying to make sense of it in light of the suffering, and are trying to sort of be like, okay, well, let's have Jesus know that he's going to suffer. Historically speaking, did Jesus know he was going to suffer? Maybe. And I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt that if he's going to go to Jerusalem during Passover and get into arguments where Rome is watching at every corner, I have to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that he probably knew he was going to get in trouble and maybe killed. I don't know if he knew months before, if that was going to happen, but the writer is trying to put that into the story, right? He doesn't want anyone in the story to be surprised that he's going to suffer. The messianic expectation for the time does not say anything about needing the Messiah to suffer, but Mark is doing midrash and is trying to make it make sense. He wants Jesus to be the Messiah. If we're not taking it as satire, he wants Jesus to be the Messiah. He knows historically that Jesus suffered greatly and died. He's going to make it make sense for the Messiah to suffer. So he calls upon the book of Isaiah, where you have a suffering servant who is in close relationship with God, who will change the ways of the world. He's going to fit the messianic expectation alongside the suffering servant. He's going to connect those dots so that it won't be a shock to the reader, and that it will make sense, and it will not take away the possibility of Jesus still being the Christ. We have Jesus as Son of Man, Son of God, the Christ, suffering, heals people. And someone said this last class, someone asked if he was like a huge disruptor. He wasn't a huge disruptor in terms of Jewish theology, in that Jews at this time period are arguing with each other about how best to be Jewish, how best to be in relationship with their God. But he does deeply disrupt the expectations of family. He goes around already, chapter 1, and gets students, disciples means students, and asks them to leave their entire lives and go with him. The family unit at this time period is everything. You do not leave your family unit. And he is completely disrupting that societal expectation. Right? You get married, you leave the family, you have children, you create your business, so to speak. Family is a business as best as you can. And he disrupts all of that. So he is a disruptor in that sense in Mark's gospel. Again, though, not part of the messianic expectation. Disruptor, disruptive man.
It's also, isn't it, the suffering servant as the king? The king as the suffering servant is also a disruption.
Yes. So those, my grad course is on gender in the Bible. So those who study gender in the Bible, all of this is gendered. It's all, everything in this time period is on a hierarchical scale that is remarkably gendered, where maleness is at the top, and to be the proper, strong king male is to never be penetrated emotionally, physically, and Jesus is, in all senses, the penetrated one. And if you don't take this as satire, if you think that Mark's Jesus is earnestly, from his perspective, the Christ, he's a penetrated Christ. He is a feminized Christ, an effeminate Christ, a hurt Christ. And that's completely disrupting societal gender expectations. And many feminist critics will applaud that.
How are you using the word Christ?
As a title, as just a synonym for Messiah.
Oh, okay, just a synonym.
Just a
Okay,
synonym. Yep, it's
But
just
it's-
the Greek.
but it refers to God.
No, it
Oh, it
refers to
doesn't.
Messiah. So the messianic expectation was just that a person, like really a human in the line of King David, will overthrow the powers that be.
Okay.
It's if you connect the Messiah with the Son of Man, which is done in Daniel and is done in this gospel, that it brings the humanness of the Messiah in connection with the divine realm. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's just a title. On its own, it doesn't carry divine expectations, but when you connect it with the title Son of Man, it brings divinity into play. Anything else about what you notice of the character Jesus, what he does, where he goes? Well, yeah, we don't think that Josephus actually knew Jesus, but he is a contemporary of Jesus.
You don't think, I'm sorry.
Josephus is a Jewish historian,
Josephus, okay.
a contemporary of Jesus. It's
He wouldn't be too young to be. If he wrote after the fall of Jerusalem,
fair. I mean, he would have been quite young.
he would have been very young.
Yeah. Yeah, but could have been like 10.
He claims to have been president in Masada, so if he was a warrior in Masada, he would have been in his 30s.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a fair point. Yeah,
Had to be born out.
fair. Yeah.
But there's another aspect to it. There's a reference to the fall of Jerusalem in Mark. And one thought that I've played with over the years is the shocking outcome of the fall of Jerusalem, both to Christians and to Jews alike, even though they probably weren't very well distinct from each other at the time. That would have been, we were expecting Jesus to return and for the Messiah to return and usher in the new era. That would have been the time for it to happen, to keep Rome from destroying the temples.
Yeah,
And it didn't.
Yeah.
And that was a catastrophe in the eyes of everybody. So there's an overlap between the story of Jesus
Yes.
and the story of Israel and the story of
Yes.
Jerusalem.
yes, and that
All the way
overlap.
down, to the putting guards on at the tomb to prevent the stealing the body. There were guards put on Jerusalem to prevent Jerusalem from coming back to life after the destruction.
Yes, yes, and if we had to use one word to talk about this overlapping, it would be suffering. There is deep, deep, deep pain and suffering happening throughout this story. So from a 70 post-fall of the temple, Christ following perspective, Jesus suffered greatly. And there's suffering happening more now with the fall of the temple. There's a massive Jewish-Roman war, the Jews lose. So to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, you need to believe that he's going to overthrow the powers that be and bring about a new world order, right? Mark knows, though, that Rome overthrew him. He does, though, include one element of hope, and it's not just that in his perspective or his characterization of Jesus, suffering is supposed to happen. He adds the resurrection. So we also have to ask ourselves, what was resurrection at this time period? Resurrection in Jewishness at this time period wasn't one person dies and they go off to an afterlife, and then another individual dies and they individually go out to an afterlife. That's not how it was conceptualized. It was conceptualized in relation to the oncoming of the Messianic age. The idea was that when the Messiah comes, there's going to be a change of order. And when that change of order happens, all of the righteous will be resurrected and be welcomed into the new world order. So if you have died prior to the Messiah coming, that's okay. You have a chance, so long as you were righteous, to be resurrected as a full group with others and welcomed into the Messianic age. So if someone believed that Jesus on his own resurrected, that would signal to them the communal resurrection must be imminent. It must be happening. So Jesus dies, you believe he resurrected, that's the hope, that's the kernel that you hold on to, that the Messianic age and the rest of the resurrected bodies are about to happen at any point. That's how you can maintain that Jesus is the Christ. If you don't have that, your theology falls apart. Rome overthrew him, he died. End of story. But if you have the resurrection, and if you add on to it stories of suffering is supposed to be part of this, you have hope for Jesus to finish the job. The idea was that Jesus will finish the job, overthrow Rome, the rest of the resurrected bodies will come through, and then the temple is destroyed. Leading people to question, was this ever our guy to begin with? He dies in 30, people question, is this our guy to begin with? I'm sure many leave the movement, some stay. There's a Jewish-Roman war, people thinking this is the time, this is the time, this is the time. The Jews lose. Jesus doesn't come back. Rome stays standing. This isn't our guy. Others still, though, maintained, not yet, just wait, just wait, just wait. The suffering is a key element of this story. And Mark knows that there is suffering. Mark knows that there is confusion. Mark knows that people are leaving the movement. And so he's honest about it and puts it right there. Jesus is going to suffer. This is part of it. So, Jesus, Son of God, Son of Man, heals people, disrupts the family unit, travels around talking about his Jewish theology, suffers, dies, resurrects. He also goes to the mikvah. That's what we now call baptism. Mikvah is a Jewish ritual where you are immersed in water as a form of physical and spiritual purification. When Jesus goes to get baptized by John the Baptist, he's participating in the Jewish ritual of mikvah. So he is just continually showing his Jewishness. That's the point of that. So Jesus is Jewish here. Mark is situating him in Jewish theology, referring to him with Jewish titles, and then doing Jewish midrash, adding things onto the story and filling in the gaps in a way that makes sense to him. There's one other huge part of the story that is significant to Mark. Mark's Jesus is the most suffering of Jesuses in all of the Gospels, although I would make the claim that John's Jesus suffers greatly too, even though that one is read as like the most heroic of Jesuses. I actually think he's greatly suffering. Mark's Jesus screams a death cry, on the cross just before he expires, leading scholars to think this he's very suffering, whereas John's Jesus is quite silent. But if any of us have experienced great trauma, we know that sometimes silence is showcasing deep anguish, more than being vocal. You can dissociate and completely leave yourself and have no access to language at all. So just because Jesus is silent to John on the cross doesn't mean that he's not suffering greatly. But Mark's Jesus screams. The narrator says that Jesus suffers, and he also says that Jesus is secretive. Mark's Jesus throughout doesn't want anyone to know that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, or the Son of Man, none of it. And when he even heals people are like, wow, you are special. He's like, no, tell no one. I don't want anyone to know. So there's this theme that's circulating throughout the gospel of Jesus suffering greatly and Jesus keeping his identity a secret, which is interesting because everyone is confused, right? We're going to connect, as Mark is trying to connect the dots, we're going to connect the dots next week. So if you're at all confused right now, like what is going on? What is the point of this? It will make sense next week when we bring his disciples in, when we bring his followers in, and we talk more about Mark's ending. But Mark's disciples, just as a preview, are remarkably confused, as they should be, as I'm sure maybe you are when I keep saying he's not fulfilling any messianic expectation. The disciples know this. They're like, what is going on? Who are you? What is this? And instead of giving a clear answer, Jesus is just kind of like, well, I don't really want to talk about it. And if anyone actually starts to assume that they have it right and does have it right, I'm going to tell them, don't tell anyone. Right? So it's like Mark is creating a world of confusion. He is sustaining confusion from start to finish. No one knows what's up. And if they do, Jesus says, don't tell anyone.
But it's a fertile confusion.
Say more.
It's a very fertile
Yeah,
confusion.
how so?
I can't put it into words. It just did.
Okay, so it does something. It has purpose. It's doing something.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna.
It's all about holding
Sure.
sacred spaces.
Yeah.
It's just like when he came into Jerusalem.
Let's think on that, because this is where we're going next week, but I see it.
telling you it's about time.
Okay, yeah. So where we are now, if you are confused, you are in the exact right spot. Everyone is confused in Mark's gospel. Who is this guy? Why is he suffering? Where's the overthrowing of Rome? How is he, what is this? What is going on? We are in deep pain. What is this? And we will answer that next week.
Is it 2 weeks from now?
I'm sorry, 2 weeks from now.